here, but thank you very much, my friend.
Yeah, thank you.
Yep.
Yeah, Todd called me like 3 hours ago and told me he needed someone to speak, so I'm really prepared. I just brought my tackle box and a few charter setups. But like you said, I grew up here, grew up over in Boggy Bayou, been fishing this area since I was 3, and so it's really my only hobby. I didn't hunt, I played sports growing up, but it was pretty much just fishing. And it grew into a passion, and me and my brother, like he said, started tournament fishing in college and did that pretty hard for about 10 years. And that grew into charter fishing. I've been doing that for 14 years, and so I've been getting after it, trying to catch these fish for quite a while in our bay. Real quick, I just want to find out what specifically the general idea of what y'all are wanting to get out of this. So just real quick, just by a show of hands, who in here is looking to catch really big redfish? Like that's the main goal of tonight. Like they want the big redfish. So just a few. What about trout? Specifically speckled trout, like that's what you really want to target. All right. What about like big trout or just keeper, just looking to eat, but you want like the big trout? Anything? All right. Who in here just wants to catch fish? Like they go out and they kind of have, okay, so that's the general is like you go out and whatever the opportunity presents itself, like you're able to, all right. So that's kind of how I'll gear what I'm going to share tonight. The winter time actually is a really good time to fish. It's the only time that I really was able to fish growing up a lot because I was involved in so many sports over the years that when it kind of calmed down, Thanksgiving and Christmas were just a real slow time of the year. I was able to do that. And then I actually taught high school for a while and had the summers off. And so I was able to start fishing in summers for really the first time in my life a lot because it wasn't taken up with sports and all of that. And then once I started guiding, I wasn't able to fun fish a lot until back to the winters because it would slow down with charters. And so really, most of my life has consisted of fun fishing when it's cooler temps. So this time of year is actually one of my favorite times to fish. And I think that it's actually a myth. A lot of people think like fish don't show up on the flats anymore. They leave the shallow waters. They're going to deep water. You can only fish by Mid-Bay Bridge, stuff like that. But that's actually not true. Flats fishing in the winter can be really, really good. And you can catch a lot of big trout, you can catch a lot of big redfish, you can catch a lot of keepers, even in real shallow water. Everything changes in the winter, so your tactics and strategies, the lures you use, the live bait you use, sometimes you have to go from heavy line to light line. There's just a lot of little things that go along with it. But I'm going to go kind of from the most basic forms of fishing that you can do in the winter and get down to like more tactical, real high skilled level fishing. One of the easiest things to do is going to a bridge and using just a Carolina rig, just a simple heavy weight. This is set up for the Destin Bridge. I got a real heavy weight on there. Anytime there's an outgoing tide or a strong incoming tide, you just anchor up with the tide and the line will just get dragged out with the tide toward the bridge. You get a live shrimp or a live, if you can get finger mullet, croaker, anything, but shrimp is going to be the easiest thing. This is probably the easiest form of fishing you can do in the winter is anchor up, throw a bait on here, toss it out, you put it in a rod holder, and you just sit. And you'll just watch your rod barely bent, and if a fish gets it, it doubles over, you start reeling, pick it up, catch a fish. This is really like the most basic, easiest way of fishing in the winter is check the tides, or even if you don't check the tides, a lot of times you just go to the bridge. If it's incoming, you set up on the jetty side. If it's outgoing, you set up on the bay side. You just anchor, you start drifting with the current, and you set up accordingly. When I'm around the Mid-Bay Bridge, kind of the same thing, but I'll go lighter. So usually I'll use something like a knocker rig. Where's it at? So if I'm hooking into real big fish, I can still use the heavier setups. But around the Mid-Bay Bridge, do the same thing. You can anchor up with the current or with the wind, whatever's stronger, and just use a light line. I use, it's kind of a medium-sized setup. But same thing, I like to use a knocker rig, but you can use a Carolina rig as well. But same thing, use shrimp, use finger mullet, use pinfish, croaker, whatever you can get your hands on. And again, it's just super basic. Pick a piling. If you really want to get, to where you're searching more, you can put on your depth finder, and you can actually kind of weave in and out of pilings and look for fish, look for bait. And when you see a large concentration of stuff on your bottom machine, you can try there. But for the most part, it's just a kind of a crapshoot. You're just kind of going to a piling and just experimenting and trying it. But I would say this time of year, that's one of the most basic, easiest ways of fishing is just live bait. Go to the Destin Bridge, go to the Mid-Bay Bridge. You cast with the current or just drop straight down. And I mean, you can catch all sorts of stuff. Black drum and redfish and sheepshead. And I caught a little grouper at Mid-Bay Bridge just last week. It wasn't keeper size, but it was still fun to catch it mixed in with some mangrove snapper and redfish and all that. So that's kind of the real basic level. Once you start getting into the back bays, you kind of take that mindset and fish around docks. And you can do the same thing. I use a knocker rig, 10, 15 pound braid with 20 pound leader. And same thing, live bait. You anchor up, you cast toward the dock, you let it sit. Super basic, super easy. It's not a lot of skill involved. But this time of year, especially the deeper docks, so like you go back into Indian Bayou, you go back into Jones Bayou, Marlar Bayou, go across to Niceville side, you got Lake Pippin, you got Grassy Lake, you got Rocky Bayou and Boggy Bayou and all these bigger bayous in this area. And they got what we call, we refer to them as just deeper docks. Anything from like 6 to 12 feet deep. And with the water level being lower, you get in that deeper water and fish aren't as spooky. And so you just get close to these docks and cast out next to the pilings. And same thing, you're just using live bait, just letting it sit and waiting for a bite. Any questions at this point about those strategies? Bridge fishing, dock fishing with live bait?
How do you keep your catfish alive?
You don't. Usually in the winter, you don't really catch too many catfish. I mean, it really is, for whatever reason, winter through the spring, we don't catch a lot, and then all of a sudden it's like April, they show up, and you start catching a bunch of them. It's a lot of mangrove snapper, redfish, speckled trout, sometimes sheepshead, black drum, that kind of thing around the docks and the bridges. But yeah, I would say if you just want to go out and just do something really easy, that's what it is. Anchor up, throw out a live bait at a bridge, throw it at a dock, and you just wait for a fish to bite. As far as rigging, I use typically 3/4 ounce egg sinkers, egg weights, and maybe a 3/0 or 4/0 hook, depending on the size of the bait. If I'm using thin baits like pinfish, croaker, finger mullet, I'll probably use like a 4/0. If I'm using shrimp, I might go as low as a 1/0, just little circle hooks. You can also go super light if you want to get like, a little mangrove snapper, go to like a mosquito hook, a size 1/0 mosquito hook made by owner, or any kind of just a small profile hook can do the trick. Yeah, but that's the kind of the easy way of fishing. So the whole time I'm doing this too, as you're going from spot to spot, something you need to look for, and it's been happening a lot recently, is you'll see redfish or jack crevalle on top of the water. Sometimes you'll see them just cruising, sometimes you'll see them feeding. Sometimes you'll see schools of pogies, the menhaden, that are, big menhaden that are all schooled up over the bay right now. You'll see them, looks like little flicks. So if you come across an area and you just see flicks, just flicks everywhere, sometimes pelicans diving down on them. Sometimes they're swirling on top. So you don't necessarily see the reds right from the get-go, but you'll see the bait fish. And you just slow down and look at it, fish that area. A lot of times what I'll do if I see that as I'm going from spot to spot, I'll just throw out a topwater lure, something like this. I mean, really, honestly, any topwater lure. I use a skitter walk, but anything that's going to make a bunch of noise on top, do that. Or I'll use a popping cork. This has been something cool. I almost always, in the past, have used these popping corks in shallow water. I've been using them in deeper water now when I find that bait, throwing out live bait under the cork and just working it like a topwater lure, like a lip lure, and just ripping it, trying to make as much noise as possible. And that's been working. So that's been something new that I've done this year. And there's actually another charter captain that goes out east. He's been using these popping corks and doing that. And so I started using it, and we've been catching a lot of big redfish just on surface level popping corks in 20 feet of water. So it's something to be aware of as you're going spot to spot. I was going to Rocky Bayou a week ago, came across a school of minimum 2,000 big jack crevalle on top of the water. Just slick calm. I saw fins out of the water. I was by myself looking for bait fish. Didn't have any rod and reel on the boat. And I just stopped and took a bunch of videos and pictures and called my captains that were on other boats and told them to come over. They both pulled up, hooked up instantly. But it was something just random. I was running to the back of Rocky Bayou and look up, and there's just literally for like half an hour, 2,000 plus big jack crevalle just swimming all over the place. So it's stuff like that, and it seems to happen fall to spring, like when it's cooler temps, you find stuff like that. So it's kind of like you just always need to be ready for just a random big school of jacks, redfish, big school of bait fish that you see that you can just come up on and drift through and fish. So that's something that you're always looking for too while you're going spot to spot. Something else that's a little more challenging, but it's still pretty easy, is going into these back bay areas. All the ones I mentioned before, we got Jones Bayou, Indian Bayou, Marlar. You got on the north side, Pippin, Grassy. There's a bunch of little bayous in Rocky, a bunch of little bayous in Boggy. Basically any creek-fed, little pond-looking bayou off of a main bayou. Trout, especially this time of year, like the more cold fronts we get moved through, the more the trout will just dive right into those areas. And it's all like 3 to 5 feet of water typically, sometimes deeper, but 3 to 5 feet seems to be like the norm. And that's when you can catch hundreds of trout some days, where it's just you'll catch, 70% of them will be small, little dink trout, but then you'll catch the 16, 17, 18 inches as well. So whenever I fish those type of areas, the easiest is probably going to be popping cork and shrimp, and that's just a tried and true method where you'll, put a shrimp under it and you can work it, you can let it sit, super easy. I even catch pompano this time of year too. It's something in the winter. You'll catch pompano mixed in with little redfish, little trout, so that's kind of cool, using shrimp under a cork. You can also free line. A lot of times I'll set up, it's what I call going straight 8. It's just 8-pound Andy mono. And whatever bait I'm using, a little shrimp or a little greenie or just usually little baits, little tiny hook. This is a size 1 mosquito hook. And whenever they get finicky, they won't hit the shrimp under the cork. They won't, hit my lures or whatever, as long as I have live bait, especially shrimp. I'll free line with a super light, I'll even go 6-pound fluoro sometimes, just straight 6-pound main line and a hook and fly line shrimp. And sometimes you'll watch the trout ignore all of your other stuff, and then you'll see the exact same trout hit a fly line shrimp that is just, I guess less cumbersome. It's less visible. It's not as scary, not as spooky. I don't know. Trout in the winter can be super weird about that, where you won't catch them on 15-pound leader, but then you go to 6-pound fluoro, and all of a sudden you start catching them. You have the chance of breaking off, but typically you won't. But that's a super important thing in the winter when you're fishing these back bays, is especially because you're not really fishing structure. You don't have to worry about oysters. You don't have to worry about docks. You're not trying to haul them away from something. You can afford to loosen the drag a little bit more and play them. So you can get away with, as little, honestly, as 4. I got a buddy that likes to fish Mirrodines with 4-pound fluoro, and he swears by it. And he only goes to areas where he can't break off, and he catches really big trout doing that. It's Mr. Brunson. I only go as low as 8. I don't really see a difference. I've tried 6, and I keep on breaking off on 6-pound. But I guess if you loosen your drag and you really know how to play them, 8 seems to be the right for me. Anyways, that's a really good way to catch them. And you can even, if you don't have live bait, something that I found that works almost as good as live bait is using something like a DOA shrimp. And same thing, you want to go super light with it. Any color, I typically go to clear whenever I use stuff in the winter. But same thing, you want to use it and retrieve it very slowly. You want to let it sink down, barely twitch it, let it sink down, barely twitch it. And so if you don't have live bait, that's another good option, is using super light line and doing that. The other thing when you're back in these bays is just using kind of conventional artificial lures, and those work a lot too. And what I typically use, this is probably what I throw 9 times out of 10 if I'm throwing a lure. Not this specifically, but a 1/4 ounce jig head with the soft plastic. And that's just a great way to search them out, search for fish. But like I said, if I find them and they're not biting, I'll quickly put this up and I'll go to, something lighter, something 8-pound mono and a DOA or 8-pound mono and live bait. Another way to rig for artificial in these areas is, and all this is going to transfer over to the flats fishing once we get into the flats. But another really good lure for the winter is a weedless. I'm kind of stuck right now on a, it's made by Owner, it's a twist lock. I think this is 1/8 ounce 4/0, but it's just a weedless setup. You put a gulp or any really soft plastic that you want to put on it. One tip that I have found for catching trout specifically is they prefer, versus the paddle tail style, they prefer something with a pointy tail. I don't know why, but that seems to be, if I'm using a paddle tail, it works great for redfish. Sometimes I catch trout, but if I'm using something like a fluke style, like the jerk shad with gulp, Fish Bites makes one, Fight Club, I forgot to bring them, but it's got a pointy tail on it. They're a scented soft plastic, but a soft plastic with just a straight pointed tail, for whatever reason, seems to work better as far as lure selection for trout. Redfish like it too. But yeah, so that's kind of covering the back bay area. So that's kind of mid-level. That's still pretty easy. Go in these back bay areas. You don't have to key in on structure or anything. You just fish the bank and you can fish out in the middle. You kind of just fan cast until you figure out where they are, and then you key in on them. What I like to do, so that kind of covers the easier way of fishing. What I think is really fun, and I like it because most people I'll hear this comment usually around November, December, have the fish moved off the flats. I hear that all the time. And I have to make a decision. Do I tell them, no, they never move off the flats, or do I tell them, yeah, they're all off the flats, you should not go fishing on the flats, because I want to fish the flats. But the truth is they do not move off the flats. Fish are always on the flats, always, always, always. It's just that in the warmer months, they spread out, and so you'll go to a flat and you'll see a redfish, see a trout, see a redfish, see a trout. You'll see, okay, they're kind of spread out, there they are. In the winter, you'll cover 2 miles of a flat, not see a single thing, and then stumble upon 150 trout and a school of 50 redfish. And it's like, okay, so they are here, they're just all bunched up, and they're in one specific spot. And so you kind of have to be able to suffer through sometimes a couple miles of nothing to figure out where they are. But a lot of times, once you figure that out, you go back out the next time, they're going to be in that similar area. They definitely key in on specific, it's not consistent, but it's specific. They'll, for whatever reason, they'll key in on certain areas, and they'll kind of hang out in those areas for the winter. They might not be there one day, but if you keep going enough, it seems like there's certain areas that will hold them. So the winter, for me, is all about eliminating water. I mean, I'll cover flats, and sometimes I'll just get up. I have tower boats, and so I'll get up in my tower, set my trolling motor on like 7, and I'm just booking it. I might not even have a rod and reel ready to cast. I'm just trying to find out where are these areas going to be that are holding the fish. And then once you're confident that you find the fish, like once you're confident they're in an area, then it doesn't necessarily matter what you're using. It's more about the approach. The water level this time of year is lower, so they're going to be more skittish. It's clearer water. They're just going to be more spooky. This is the time of year people always complain about, yeah, I saw 20 redfish, I casted all 20 of them, didn't hook one. And it just seems to be the norm where they're just really spooky, really skittish. And you can sight fish them. I sight fish them all the time, and it's fun. But for me, I think the key is not trying to sight fish them. I think by the time you've seen fish on our flats, 80, 90% of the time they're going to be spooked. It's just not something you can do consistently well. It's still fun. I think it's worth doing. It challenges you, and it's great when you actually get one to bite, because it is very rewarding to see a fish and watch. It's really cool when you can do it. So I'm not saying you can't, but I've discovered that blind casting very far cast away where I think fish are going to be will produce more strikes than trying to wait till I'm really close and picking one out here and one out there. So for me, I've kind of figured out what works for me. The trick is I use 10-pound braided line. I pack it on. I always have a full spool so I can cast really far. And I use 15-pound fluorocarbon leader. And I'm pretty much, it kind of sounds weird, and I'm weird about it because I think there's a philosophy behind fishing, and you get into like tactics and strategies and all that. But I actually envision where I think fish are going to be on the flats based on where I've seen them recently. And it's almost like you're acting like you're sight fishing. So you fish with absolute confidence, like there are fish there, and you're working the lure in those spots, expecting a bite. The only difference is you're casting 2 to 3 times further than you would sight fishing, so the fish aren't going to be as spooky. And if you find the fish in that area, you can actually catch a lot in the winter. So for the lures that I like to use, I will throw, for the most part, if I can find sandy patches on the flat, I'll throw something like this, a jig head, a 1/4 ounce jig head with any kind of soft plastic. You can use Gulp. You can use, one of my favorites is a Made by Mirror lure. It's just a 4-inch, trying to think of what the name of it is. It's like 4-inch soft shad, I think, but it's got a paddle tail. I use Opening Night. It's just a crystal clear soft plastic, something like that. Or you can go, one of my other favorites is using Gulp and the 4-inch swimming mullet. It's just the curl tail Gulp. But anything that you can throw into sand and not get boogered up in the grass, I'll use this. Whenever there's really thick grass, there's a few spots that will hold fish in the winter that are real grassed over. There's not much sand at all. And that's when I'll go. And I rarely, if I'm trying to cast far, this is my ultralight. I hardly ever use this when I'm trying to make super long casts. It just doesn't cast as far. I'll use the 2500 size with the 10-pound braided line. It just seems to cast at least 10, 20 yards further than these ultralights. But this is the type of hook that I'll use. And typically, more times than not, if I'm really trying to catch, like I'm just not out there goofing off, and I really want to, tournament fishing, or I just really want to make sure I'm catching fish, I go to Gulp. I don't think it's a gimmick. I don't think that it's, I think scented really does work. I've noticed a big difference. I've used different soft plastics and tried the, pouring on a bunch of gel scented stuff and all that. And for whatever reason, Gulp seems to work. And when I'm using weedless, I'll really only use the, I think it's the 5-inch jerk shad. It's the one with the little fork tail, fluke style, if any bass fishermen are in here. But I use that, and it's, hands down one of the best winter lures that you can use for working through flats, working through grass and all that. It produces a ton of fish, and I've used it, for well over 15, 20 years, and it's always my fallback. Something else you can do that does work well, I like it because you can cast them in an absolute mile. It's Paul Brown's, I think they were bought out by Mirror Lure. But they're basically a Mirrodine in the soft form. So it's kind of a soft plastic. You get the benefit of a soft plastic. Looks a little more realistic, I guess, but it casts a long ways. If there's not a lot of grass on a flat, I'm not worried about it getting boogered up. I love using those. I've hammered redfish and a few trout, but mainly redfish on the flats when I want to cast an absolute mile and I'm not worried about hooking the grass. You find a little bit deeper gut that maybe is 3 feet deep, 2-3 feet deep, and you can afford to get away with treble hooks. That's a great lure. So any kind of suspending lure like that, where you can let it go down for a half a second or second, and then work it, let it sink down. So it has the same kind of action as a DOA shrimp, but you can cast it 3 times further than a DOA shrimp. So that works a lot. But honestly, the more than your lure selection, that is important. It's good to know what lure to throw once you're in the situation. But honestly, I think if I had to really pinpoint what's going to matter the most, it's getting on the water and being willing to sacrifice time and look. If you have any tower or even just a cooler that you can get on with the trolling motor and just cruise a flat, preferably with the trolling motor. With the motor, you're just going to eat the grass with your prop constantly because you'll come across some really shallow sandbars. But I think that's probably the number one best advice I can give is go look. Just search. Just go to an area you've never even gone before and just, you might not think there's anything there, and a lot of times you're shocked at how many fish you'll see on a flat, and then start to key in on, all right, they're hugging the bank for whatever reason. Maybe it's low tide or it's high tide, or what's the factor that could be causing them to hug the bank, or maybe they're off the bank in a gut. I refer to guts as the ones that are, if you look on Google Maps, you'll see these diagonal sandbars, typically diagonal, that run along. Like if you look at the flat between Baytown and here, there's probably 20 or 30 diagonal sandbars with grass on the deep side, sand on the shallow side. That's what I mean by guts. Sometimes you'll find them keyed in on those guts. And it's like, all right, they're on these guts. And then you know the pattern, you stick to that pattern, and you just fish those guts. Sometimes they're literally underneath docks and right on the bank. And you need to know that. I mean, in the winter, you can't really afford to just do your normal spring, summer, fall routine of just go out and fan cast around. Like I said earlier, they're going to be keyed in very specific areas, typically schooled up to where you can't just fan cast a bunch and then dumb luck find them. I mean, you kind of have to know before you start fishing for them of the general area of where they're going to be, which is why I think searching is so important. Getting the time on the water and sacrificing maybe an entire day, and pick your days. So when it's less than 3 mile per hour wind, super sunny, and it's going to be low tide starting out in the morning where the water level is going to be super low, and you'll see for miles just everywhere. That's like perfect conditions. That's the day that you might go, all right, today I'm searching, I'm not fishing. Other days it could be windy, overcast, you're like, there's no sense in searching, I'm just going to go where I think fish are and fish and have fun. But yeah, I think flats fishing, for me, that's where you're going to find, especially this time of year, you're going to find the bigger fish, you're going to find the bigger trout, you're going to find really good redfish. That's where you find upper slots and bulls on the flats, and that's a lot of fun. Something I'll do too, and this is something that I've done this since I was little, just because I love seeing it, is using any kind of live bait fly lined in the tail and having them swim on top. So any of these spots, you can go in the back bays, you can go in deep water, you can go creek mouths where it ends up being 6 inches deep right at the the edge of the creek mouth, and using a live bait. And what I mean by fly line is what's set up here. It's just nothing but a line and a hook. You can use a leader line, you can use just straight 8 like this, but it's if you can get a hold of I like finger mullet because they stay on top, which is really cool. If you can find pogies work. Croaker, if you can find croaker. Like I said, I like finger mullet, and I've had a lot of luck doing this, is going to these back areas, like I was talking about, where you catch the small trout. You go to the creeks, you'll go to the flats where it's just super, super shallow, and you'll tail hook them so they swim out, but you'll throw it out there and just let them swim. And it calls for a lot of patience. You just have to wait. But I've caught a lot of my gator trout that I catch in the winter. A lot of them come off of finger mullet, fly line hooked in the tail. You catch a lot of big redfish doing that. Again, you have to be confident the fish are there, because if you're doing that in an area where there's no fish for 2 miles on either side of you, what's the point? So that's why I always go back to finding the fish is probably more important than tactics, but you need to know the tactics for when you do find the fish. You're all right. I have a pot, because I've done this before where I find 40 plus big trout in the back of a creek, and I'm going, I can't catch them. I see them every time I go back there. There they are. Can't catch them. And it kills me. And I try everything I can. And that's really what caused me to try to figure out different ways of doing it. And if I can't get anything to catch them, doing the fly line live bait is probably the number one way with like a finger mullet, or if you can get shrimp doing that. If you can't catch them doing that, probably not going to catch them. So that's what I got. I guess now we can open it up to questions, kind of get more specific with stuff you're looking to find out, and I can just answer those questions. Yeah.
So my problem is I always get too close to the shoreline, and then I'll see guides that are fishing that are a quarter mile away from the shore. So what do you recommend?
Yeah. So the question is basically, do you get close to the bank where I would say most people I would just say in general, most people think, all right, the fish are going to be on the bank, they're going to be close to docks. And like you said, you'll see charters that'll be out sometimes 200 yards off of a bank fishing a very specific area, catching fish. And my answer to that is fish are everywhere. They're in specific locations, but they could be anywhere in the bay as far as depth, as far as on the grass flats. So it really is. And I would say in the winter, you're probably not going to catch them too far out. You can. I've done it. But as far as trout are going to go back to those bayous for the most part. They go to the rivers. They go to freshwater sources. They go to creeks, stuff like that. Redfish, you can still catch, farther out from the bank. But then it's just a matter of figuring out where. And then when you do see a charter fishing far out, they're not just randomly fishing far out. Whenever we're anchored in a spot, we're fishing extremely specific areas. Like we don't just go to a spot anchor and it's like, sometimes we're like pinpointing literally one sandy, we call them potholes, but sandy patch in the middle of grass. And it's like, yeah, if you can get a bait right there, you catch a fish. Go right there, you don't. Go right there, you don't. Get it right there, you catch a fish. Then you start to key in on like, all right, so like on this gut, in that sandy pothole, that's where fish like to be. And it's true. Like they key in on very specific certain areas. So it's never random. You can catch them randomly and not know why they're there, but it's never, for the fish, from their perspective, it's not random. Like they were in that spot because that's where they like to be. They don't just randomly just swim in, no man's land.
So how far do you swim when there's a freshwater stream coming to a finger? Like, are you right at it where it comes in, or are you?
Yeah, so how far away from the creek mouth? I went back in a creek not too long ago. I know it wasn't cold, but I get back into areas just for looking for bait. I want to see what's there. And this one is over by Eglin Air Force Base, and I got back to where I couldn't even move my boat anymore. My trolling motor was stuck in mud, and I saw something pushing, literally as far back as you could possibly go before it got to where my boat wouldn't even fit. And it was a 4-pound redfish just back there feeding. And so they can be back. I've fished areas in Louisiana where we'll go back in there, and you'll see backs out of the water. You'll 8 inches of water, and redfish are up there like nosing up trying to get a fiddler crab or something on a bank. And they just, they're a hardy, strong, tough fish. They don't care. And so they'll be in super shallow. They'll also be, a lot of times when you come into those bayous, it's always good to try the drop off from the flat as soon as you get into the bayou or the area that's deeper. Right on that drop off tends to be a spot where they hold up. Then there's just kind of areas in there that can hold them. But yeah, I'll go, a lot of times I'll go straight all the way far back as I can. And that's where I absolutely love to do the fly line with the mullet. Just because you can get the mullet, you can flip the bail, and you get the mullet to swim back super far and twice as far as you can cast. And then you see the explosion. Big trout will go after it, big redfish. So yeah, you go back as far as you possibly can, especially when you're looking. Like you just want to know. Like why not? Just go back, look, oh, nothing there. Sometimes you go back and literally you will spook 100 trout. And it's awesome. It's like, all right, I spooked them. Not going to catch them now, but at least you went back there and like, all right, when it's cold, the sun's up, they want to get on this mud or whatever. So it's just good to know. It's good to, are they back in the creek? Are they on the drop-off? Are they still on the flat? Are they, in the middle of the bayou, whatever? So, any other questions? Yeah.
Like it kind of set like you look at these potholes, it's like a king-size bass bed up in the grass. Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Yeah, and I don't know. It's they're not bedding. Trout don't bed on the flats. They're bedding back in the mud, back in the creeks, that kind of thing, back in those bayous. And the redfish don't bed because they're not producing until they're like 8, 9, 10 pounds. They're not reproducing anything. I don't necessarily know. It just looks like a bed, yeah. And it'll be, and you can even, one thing that I've keyed in on is you can look at the color of the sand. So like the real yellow sand is going to be the shallower sand. If you see an area that is almost like a greenish yellow, darker colored sand, that's deep sand. So if you see the deeper sand, you're like, all right, it's a deep sandy pocket in grass. There's grass everywhere, and you see a good sized sandy patch, it's like, I'm going to cast right there. I mean, it's like a magnet for me. I see sand and I'm casting over the sand, I'll reel it back to the sand, and then I'll work my jig head through the sand and I'll reel it in through the grass. And then another sand, I'll throw it in the sand. And that seems to be, if I'm fishing the flats with the jig head, I'm focused on those areas. And then if I'm using my weedless, then I don't care. I'll just throw it, way up in super thick grass and just work it through the grass, because redfish and trout will be in that grass too. I key in on the sand specifically because I'm not going to get stuck, with the jig head. But it does seem to be, it's a great way to catch fish. And I think that they will ambush in those areas, maybe, is why they're there. But there's definitely it's a pattern that's definitely a sure thing, that they key in on those deeper sandy pockets. Anything else? Yeah. The big reds? Yeah, they'll spawn, typically they spawn offshore, but they'll spawn inshore too. We've seen them spawning in the bay where you can actually see the sperm and the eggs floating around. That's why I don't go out in the Gulf. I don't know. I've caught some redfish in super deep water. Years ago, I caught them off a wreck that was probably, 7, 8 miles offshore, 90, 95 foot of water. And they looked sickly. They didn't look good. But we released them and they swam right back down. They didn't have, it's not like the snapper and grouper when you pull them up and their stomachs are popped out of their mouth. They looked fine as far as that was concerned. But yeah, they didn't look good at all. But they were in super deep water out there. And they were, 29, 30 inches. They weren't real big. But yeah, we see them spawning sometimes in the bay. Typically in the Gulf, but sometimes in the bay. It's always comical when people hold up the big bull reds and then they have goo just coming all over them. They don't know what it is. And say, yeah, they're spawning this time of year. I'll let you figure it out, So, anything else? Yeah. I think there are definitely triggers for when they bite. There are so many factors. It's super hard to know what's going to be the factor that really gets them to trigger. But it's obvious when they're biting. It's like you can do no wrong and they're triggered. They're looking for food. They want to eat. The problem is I've had that on incoming tide, I've had it on outgoing tide, I've had it at neap tide. I've crushed the fish on the flats on a neap tide where there's no water movement, the water's stagnant, and it's middle of the day, and I don't really get it, and we have great days. I'd say more times than not, if I was going to pick this is when you want to be fishing, it would probably be whenever high tide is, 2 hours after that for the next 3, 4, 5 hours. Seems to be when the water moves the most. But wind can overpower tide here. So you can have tidal movement, like an incoming tide can be coming in, but if you have a strong east wind, that east wind will actually push the water and you'll get a current of, it looks like outgoing tide, but it's rising tide all day. And so the fish are like, oh, well, it's moving water. They don't care what tide it is. They just know this is moving water. This is an ambush point. I'm going to get on this point. And so it's wind sometimes is more of a factor than tide. And so a lot of times we decide where to fish based on wind. It's probably more than any other factor. You get a slack wind and it's like fish turn super skittish and you get a good wind at your back, all of a sudden they're biting. And so I think it has more to do with them being spooky than anything. But yeah, I do think that there are definite triggers. Barometric pressure drops, fish are biting. That's a consistent. A storm system is going to move in, all of a sudden fish just go crazy. I've had some of the best bites in my life right before I'm watching a storm system coming, down on us from the north. And it's like you're watching that black line and it's like, man, they're biting good right now. You don't want to leave because it's that barometric pressure, and I think there's something instinctive in them that's just like you need to feed, like you need to eat. I've always heard full moon. If there's a full moon at night, you want to fish at night. Early morning, because they're keyed in on the light from the moon, triggers in them to feed. They're just going to eat whenever it's easier for them to get food is when they're going to trigger to feed. That's the instinct. It's as simple as that. If it's easy to find a fish and not work as hard to eat it, that's when they're like, all right, I'm going to feed now because I have to exert less energy and I'm going to eat more. So that's why a current around a point, a wind pushing up on a bank, muddy water that's kind of churned up from the wind or the tide, they're going to get in those areas and they're like, I can ambush, I don't have to work as hard. So that's all you're looking for is what's going to make this fish want to eat right now, and it's whenever it's easier. So, anything else?
So I have another question. So I've heard many people say that, like on a windy day, that it's the wind or whatever is pushing the bait to the edge. It's not like it's seagrass. I mean, they could move.
Yeah.
Is that?
That's not a thing.
Yeah. Like,
The wind doesn't push bait up on a bank.
okay.
But when the wind is on a bank, so I always fish the windy bank. Try to. It's not, sometimes you don't have a choice when it's just slack wind. But like I was saying, when the wind hits a bank, it's gonna churn up the sand, the shallower it gets. And so fish are more apt when and you'll actually see it sometimes. You'll go to a bank and you'll see clear water, clear water, clear water, and then the next 10 feet before you get to the bank, it's like brown. And there's just brown stained water the whole bank. And it's like, I'm fishing that brown water. Because that's where, it's going to turn it up. Fish are going to be feeding because it's easier. And again, they're going to feed wherever it's easiest. So it's not that the wind is pushing bait up against the bank. It's that's the spot that the fish are finding food easier. So people catch fish on a bank that's being windblown. So they think, oh, the wind is pushing bait up on the bank. So it's like it's like people that say fish bite the best early in the morning. No, they don't. They might. They also might bite awesome. I've had days where it's awful in the morning. You go out in the afternoon, you absolutely wear them out from noon to 4. So it's really not. There's a lot of things that are said that just aren't true. So that's one of them. Wind doesn't blow. I could be wrong on that, but yeah, I don't think that wind actually blows bait up on a bank. Yeah.
You fish cut bait at all?
Yes, I love cut bait. So cut bait is one of those things where you always keep it in your back pocket for if you can't get live bait, or sometimes you always want to have, like we'll have our coolers, for the fish, but we'll have bags of cut mullet or cut pogies. And sometimes we can only find greenies or pogies that big. You hook them, throw them out there, and the pinfish will just nibble, 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 and it's gone. Well, if that's happening, then sometimes we'll put 2 or 3 on there. Nibble, nibble, nibble. It stays a little bit longer, but it's still a hassle. And as long as you're around fish, you can catch them. But something we'll do, if we have 4 people fishing, we'll do 2 with cut mullet, throw it out there, and it'll stay on for 5 minutes. The pinfish are just nibbling around. You'll catch trout, redfish. So cut bait's it's one of those things that I think is frowned upon by professional fishermen. But yeah, cut bait is great. And if you can't find live shrimp or greenies or pogies or whatever, you just catch a ladyfish. If you catch a ladyfish and you want to use cut bait, ladyfish hands down is one of the best cut baits you can use. Yeah, well, there's just something about them. Redfish love them. You can use them cut bait under a popping cork. You can use it Carolina rig, dock fishing. It's always good. But anytime you're losing baits, just pinfish are just gone. It's like cut bait is great to have because you wear yourself out. Every 30 seconds baiting and casting, baiting and casting. So, anything else? Yeah.
Yeah, do you do much trolling?
Trolling? Yeah, okay, that's something I didn't cover. I actually thought about rigging up a trolling lure. So that's something whenever I see the pogies that are just thick in an area and I can't really figure out where I want to key in on them, that's a great thing to do is troll like a stretch, depending on the depth. Right now, we're finding pogies in the back of Rocky, the back of Boggy. You go to the east, you're finding them in Hogtown. You're finding them before you get to the 331 bridge. Pogies are out in the middle of the bay right now. So there's these large schools of these big menhaden that are flicking the surface, and sometimes they're so large you're not really sure where to fish them. And me and my boys have done that recently, where it's like you're just looking around, and for like 500 yards in every direction there's bait, and you're thinking, well, I know there's redfish around, but I don't know how to key in on them. But trolling's a great way. I'd use like a stretch 15 and just throw a couple of them out and just troll the whole perimeter. Redfish do, when you find those bait schools, a lot of times you can catch them mixed in with them, but a lot of times if you find like a specific school that's more corralled than the rest, I like to fish the edges of that school. You'll actually, if you get close enough, you'll see like a wall of the bait, and they're getting pushed in, and the redfish will kind of be on the outside of them. So kind of keying in on the outside of the bait ball is a good thing too. But yeah, trolling works great, especially for redfish. Redfish love trolling plugs. And I would use something like this size, or maybe slightly heavier. And you can do braid with a 30-pound leader, or just straight. A lot of times I'll just use straight 30-pound mono and no leader. And just set your drag to where it can handle a hard strike. And you just put it in the rod holder, and that's a pretty cool, if they're biting good, I mean, you can catch a lot of redfish doing that. Somebody else have a question back here? Yep. I don't know, chartreuse is kind of the, that bright yellow tail has always been the traditional color, and it works. I would say that I've got two different schools of thought in the winter, and both have worked. And then I've also blown both schools of thought out of the water by using nuclear chicken gulp, which is bright red and bright green, on like an electric chicken jig head. And I'm like, all right, so I'm catching redfish and trout using this, but my instincts want to say that you either use something really clear, like just a translucent clear color, or like DOA using this clear color, or you go like a camo, like a dark brown, dark green, like an earthy color. And I've always done well with, like the camo 4-inch mullet, gulp swimming mullet is one of my go-to, soft plastics for the winter. Glow seems to work really good in the winter. Glow with a chartreuse tail. So I kind of either go real earthy with like just a natural gray unpainted jig head and like a camo gulp, or I'll go like I love these, glow in the dark with the chartreuse tail, and then my electric chicken jig head seems to be a good winter color. But like I said, I've also used nuclear chicken, bright red, bright green, and I'm like, all right, well, maybe they don't really care as much as I think they do. I don't know. But I think size matters for sure. So I like to use smaller if I can. That's why I like the swimming mullet made by Gulp, is because it's just a smaller profile. And if any of y'all have been on the water recently, there's these little hatchlings that are just all over the bay right now. Like, I don't know what they are, but there's little minnows that are like that big, schooled up everywhere. Every flat, every bay, just tiny, tiny little minnows everywhere. And so I think this time of year through the winter, they just get keyed in on smaller baits. And so a lot of times I'll go a little bit smaller, and that seems to make a little difference, especially on the flats, using and you can actually find, I use bass assassin jig heads. They make a pretty cool, I don't have it with me, I don't think. I might have one in there. But they make a pretty cool short shank 1/4 ounce jig head that I think is neat. I'll buy them from time. You have to order them. I've never found them in stores. That's kind of cool to use with like a 3-inch swimming mullet. So you can get still a heavy jig head with a real small, it's like a 2/0 hook, and then a smaller size, a 3-inch size swimming mullet made by Gulp, and it's like a heavier, super small soft plastic. And I like using that too. That's like I said, once you start catching fish with so many different things, you're like, yeah, that works, and that works, and that works too, and this works. And so I think knowing where the fish are and approach is probably more important than anything. But yeah, I think there are maybe some lures that work better than the rest. Any other questions? Yeah.
What did you have on your popping torch when you were fishing around the
Croaker. So I was able to get some croaker. So I was using a 4/0 or a 5/0 circle hook and just working it, and they would die, and then you just keep working it until it falls off, because usually like 1.5 feet, 2 feet, not far. So, yeah, so they'll come up. I mean, you'll see the redfish sometimes when you get on them. You'll see the redfish floating on top, and they're feeding right on top. That's why topwater lure work, popping corks work. But just trying to attract them to you is good. That's why the topwaters or the popping corks and really like raking it through the water and doing that seems to be a good attractant for them. They come over and want to know what's going on. Yeah, and you can do the same thing with a jig head and a soft plastic. I mean, those bigger redfish, when they get around bait like that, they'll eat just about anything. I do, in the spring, typically. Wintertime, you can catch them around docks. That's when we see them on the flats more, is when it's cold. But in the spring, for whatever reason, it's when they spawn. But that's when they just bite a lot easier than normal. So you can catch them. The way that I fish in the winter for mangrove snapper, that's my favorite fish to catch and eat by far. And so I'll use a Carolina rig with usually 15-pound, 12 or 15-pound leader, a little size 1 mosquito hook, and little shrimp or little fiddler crabs or little blue crabs. And you can catch sheep's head doing that. So it's pretty much when you fish for mangrove snapper, you're fishing for sheep's head. And so we'll catch sheep's head side by side with redfish and trout and mangroves, dock fishing that way. And sometimes I'll rig up that way just because I know I can catch more of a variety. I'll go lighter, and you might break off to a 8-pound redfish, but you'll catch more of the smaller, mangroves and the keeper-sized sheep's head and all that. Yeah.
Where are you finding your mangroves right now?
I mean, honestly, all over. They're all over docks. It's surprising sometimes they'll be in real shallow spots too, on docks. But
Any big ones, or you're all
no, they're all
10 inch?
8 to 12 inches, and then every once in a while you'll luck up and catch a 13-inch. And the mid-bay bridge, sometimes you'll catch 14, 15 inches, but that's usually when it's warmer. I don't catch a lot of them for whatever reason. I don't catch a lot of them at mid-bay when it's cold, but I will around deeper docks. Any other questions? Going once? Going twice? Yeah.
Any live bait that you do or don't use at certain times of the year?
So I typically don't use live shrimp when it's warmer. Anytime there's pinfish around, it's hard to use live shrimp. That being said, sometimes it's all you can get, and so you just use it. But you have to, you have to be willing to go through a lot of it. Or you have to be willing to, like if you can supplement with cut bait, like if you find an area where you're just getting nibbled off, it's like, all right, I'm going to take a 30-minute break from using shrimp, use cut bait, and that way you don't go through 8 dozen in an hour just because it turns pricey. But I would say croakers, if you can get a croaker, that's one of the best baits, hands down, for speckled trout. Redfish love it too. It's tough to get them. A lot of times you can buy them. There's a couple shrimpers that actually sell them because they're bycatch when they're shrimping. I know at Orange Beach, Alabama, all the way from there through Texas, you can buy croaker anywhere. We just don't really have bait shops that carry them for whatever reason. But croaker is probably one of my favorite baits. They stay alive forever, so you can keep them overnight. You can keep them in bait pins and all that. Pinfish work, but we hardly ever use them just because for whatever reason, they just don't seem to get as many. It's almost like fish eat them, but they don't want to eat them. It's like they just will if it's convenient. Our 2 main baits that we cast net and use consistently are pogies and greenies. So if you can find menhaden or the pilchards, the greenies, those are that's like candy for a fish. And even right now, so we're catching greenies still. They're out fishing shrimp, and they're out fishing croaker. We're getting little croaker and good sized shrimp, and when you have greenies, you're catching more fish on the greenies than you are, which I don't know why that is. You would think shrimp would be always like universally better as far as just if fish are there, they'll eat it. But greenies have been working great for the past month or two. Yeah.
Have you ever gone to the pass and cigar minnows and used them in the bay?
Yeah, we've done that a lot. Yeah, they work. I fly line them whenever I have them as leftover offshore bait, and you can fly line them. They work great. I don't think they work better than anything else, but they work. You can catch them. You drop them down by the Destin Bridge and catch big reds with them. We've done that plenty of times. In fact, a lot of offshore guys will, they'll come back in and if they know that redfish are there, they'll stop by the Destin Bridge and fish that for half an hour and try to catch some redfish real quick, end their trip that way. But yeah, cigar minnows and big thread fins. Anybody else? Well, that's all I got. Feel free to come up and, this is by no means, like I said, Todd told me 4 hours ago now that I was going to speak tonight. So I didn't go out and usually I'll go and actually buy specific lures and I'm like, all right, if I was going to fish a tournament, this is what I would have in my tackle box. I made a bulk order of down south lures because I like them. So that's what I got right now is a bunch of down south lures. But feel free to take a look at what I got and, ask questions. And I got stickers. So I actually make these popping corks. Started making them a few years ago. Send it popping corks. You can grab a sticker. I got stickers for the charter business. So feel free to grab those and ask me questions and look at all my stuff. But yeah, I appreciate it, guys. Oh, we're doing a raffle? All right. Doing a raffle. And if you have any offshore questions, you got to ask Captain James in the back.
All right.
Definitely not me.
You're gonna pick?
Sure.
All right. Just kind of put it around. Who's the winner?
Melissa Craker.
Oh, that's me. There you go. Legendary beach towel. Thank you. You're welcome, hon. All right, the next one, let's do this one.
Is this one or two?
It's together. You can.
Okay.
Yeah.
Andy Bouchain.
There you go.
It's close enough.
All right. And we're going to do the ruler and a cooler top.
Hunter LeBlanc. Hunter.
There you go.
So you did this trick. That worked. That's a trick people use. They bend it, they fold it, put a crease in it so it covers more area and you tend to grab it. That was smart. All these adults didn't know about that trick.
And we're going for another beach towel. And any
Oh,
of you
this guy
that are
did.
getting the marine mat tonight, if you have any questions about that, we own Calypso Marine Decks. So Zach's actually here, his hand's up. So if you any questions about decking for your boat, he can answer you about, if you have any questions. So
Lisa King.
Lisa. There you go. Huh? You're welcome. All right, let's do a legendary hat.
A lot of people knew about that trick apparently. Dale Gates.